I stayed up all night editing this video because plum season is almost over and you absolutely have to make this tart. Where have you been all September, Helen? You might ask. Well, I've been improving this recipe. Until now, I took a fly by the seat of my pants approach to plum tarts, just eyeballing all the filling ingredients. And you know what? That's just not good enough. The little prune plums are only here in the early fall, and making a tart that's a bit too sour or too sweet or too runny finally got to me. So I went into recipe development mode and baked tart after tart, taking careful notes until I could honestly say that this one is the best plum dessert I've ever had. Put 212 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour into the bowl of a food processor. Add 2 teaspoons of Diamond Crystal Kosher salt or 1 teaspoon of table salt and 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar and mix for 15 seconds. Then add 284 grams of unsalted butter, sliced 1/4 inch thick and chilled. That's 2½ sticks. Give it about 15 1-second pulses. The pulses should feel pretty long, like 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Unlike all the other pie dough recipes you've ever seen, the only mistake you can make here is to not process the butter enough. Most pie recipes ask you to stop when the butter is the size of peas. Not this one. Go all the way to a finely grated parmesan stage. Now measure out 142 grams of flour in a bowl and add the processed flour butter mixture to it. This extra flour will create layers. Toss these two mixtures thoroughly. There is no worry about overmixing at this point. Until you add the liquid ingredients, the gluten doesn't start to develop. I mix for 45 to 60 seconds. Now add 57 grams of very cold water mixed with 57 grams of very cold vodka. Cheap, unflavored kind, don't get creative on me here. And mix using cutting motions with a large spoon. When the liquid is absorbed, squeeze the dough with your hands until it comes together into a lump. Try to use more punching and pressing motions rather than folding motions to reduce how much gluten you develop. Form it into a log and cut in half. Move half of the dough out of the bowl and form the dough remaining in the bowl into a disc. I like to kind of wipe the bowl out with my dough. Don't worry about little cracks, that's normal. Place the dough onto a piece of plastic and wrap extremely tightly. Then press down on it. This will eliminate some cracks. Don't worry about little cracks on the side. We'll take care of them when rolling. Now repeat the shaping and wrapping procedure with the second piece of dough. Place both discs into the fridge overnight and up to 5 days, or freeze for future use. Place the dough on a well-floured surface. Sprinkle it with flour and bang it from one side to another. Rotate 90 degrees and bang again. Keep rotating and banging, being careful to keep the thickness of the dough even. This makes the butter pliable and rollable, even though it's completely cold. Letting pie dough warm up before rolling can result in a very sticky dough, so I prefer to work with it straight from the fridge. If you end up with cracks on the edges, squeeze them with your hands, folding those edges under the circle of dough, but make sure to maintain the round shape. Reflour the work surface and flatten out the dough by banging it one last time. When you have a disc that is about 1/2 inch thick, you can start rolling. After every single roll, rotate the dough. This accomplishes 2 things. It keeps the dough even and it warns you of sticking before the situation is hopeless. Keep rolling and rotating and don't be afraid of adding flour. This flour is on the outside of the dough. It won't make it tough. If you encounter sticking, unstick your dough with a pastry scraper, move it to the side, and reflour your counter. Once the dough gets big enough, you won't be able to cover all the territory with one roll. You'll need 2 to 3 rolls, and you'll need 2 hands to rotate the dough. When your dough is about 1/8 of an inch thick,
Check if it's big enough for your tart pan. My tart pan is 11 inches in diameter. It's always safer to make the dough too big than too small. What I'm looking for is close to an inch of overhang. Fold the dough in half, brush off extra flour, fold it in half again, and brush again on both sides. Now place it into the pan and unfold, shifting it as necessary to center it. Don't stretch the dough to fit it into the corners. Whatever you stretch now will shrink back in the oven. What you want to do is lift and mold the dough into the corners and press it very firmly into the sides of the pan. Trim the dough with kitchen shears, leaving a 1-inch overhang. Then take a fork and prick the dough all over to reduce the bubbles. You want to compress the dough, but not poke it all the way through. Making deep holes could cause leaking. You could blind bake the tart shell with weights, or you could freeze it for an hour. I prefer freezing because it prevents the dough from over baking by the time the plums are cooked. If you have seen my previous tart videos, you might have noticed that this is all a little different from how I used to bake tarts. I've been doing a lot of testing on this method, and I'll make a separate video on it to explain when to freeze and when to blind bake. But for the plum tart, I prefer freezing. Place the dough in the freezer uncovered for 1 hour. Preheat the oven to 400 degrees with the rack in the bottom third. Halve the plums and remove the pits. Lay each half down on the board and cut it in half. Weigh your plums. You need about 900 grams of pitted plums. Drizzle them with 1 tablespoon of lemon juice and toss. In a small bowl, mix together 135 grams of sugar, 20 grams of tapioca starch, and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. Mix very thoroughly. I've been resistant to the idea of thickening fruit tarts with starch, but the plum tart really needs it. If you've been scarred for life by the goopy store-bought fruit pies, don't worry. Tapioca doesn't make the juices goopy or cloudy, and we're using just the right amount to avoid a soup in a crust situation. Right before baking, toss your plums with the sugar mixture and arrange them vertically in the frozen tart shell. If you've noticed that my dough overhang is suddenly bigger, it's not your imagination. The dough didn't grow bigger in the freezer. I just didn't trim this one, which was a mistake, and I refilmed the rolling and trimming on another tart shell. You might have a few plums left over. If you have a lot of sugar left over on the bottom of the bowl, drizzle it over the tart. Place the tart on a baking sheet and put in the oven. Bake at 400 degrees without convection for 20 to 25 minutes, just until the dough is golden. Turn down to 375 and bake for another 20 minutes. Glaze with 2 tablespoons of microwaved apricot preserve. Turn on the convection fan if you have it, and continue baking until the plums are brown and the juices are bubbling, about 5 to 10 minutes. Make sure you get little bubbles in the filling so that the tapioca can do its thickening magic. Cool for at least 30 minutes. Then run the rolling pin along the edges to remove the extra dough. It makes a good snack. Trimming this dough after baking ensures that our walls stayed up and the juices didn't bubble out of the tart. Unmold the tart onto a cutting board and enjoy. By the way, if you can't find the little prune plums, also known as Italian plums, you can use any plum type and just arrange them differently. Let me show you the underside. You see how crispy and delicate this dough is? Even though we didn't pre-bake it, there is not a trace of sogginess. And I don't have to explain how fabulous the plums are. Now I can finally go and get some well-deserved sleep. Happy fall and happy baking.